it's really interesting. I wonder if she just thought, well, these women don't have any sons. I just have two more mouths to feed. I wonder if she thought, I'm doing them a terrible disservice, and they've been good daughters-in-law to me, and I should just let them stay home. Or I wonder, having been an immigrant herself, if she wanted to spare them the experience and how bad it can be. Because there's a verse in the Bible, in Deuteronomy 23:3, that says, Ammonites and Moabites can't belong to the Lord's assembly. Not even the 10th generation of such people can belong to the Lord's assembly. There was a lot of strife between Moab and Judah. So Moabites are part of Abraham's extended family, but they descend through Lot. Lot and his incestuous union with his daughters. In fact, Israel's hatred for their Moabite cousins was so deep that they were forbidden from marrying Moabites. And they were forbidden from allowing Moabites to enter the Lord's assembly. So we don't know what happened, but the two women continue. And they come back into Bethlehem. Now, the day that Naomi left Bethlehem, things were bad. She'd had her husband, she had her two young sons, and now she's coming back. She's 10 years older, and she has nothing. Nothing except an equally sad-looking widow that she has to take care of in her hometown. But there is a tiny bright side. She's returned at the end of the harvest, and I think she kind of probably, because this is an ideal time to return according to God's law. Because another section of Deuteronomy says, whenever you're reaping the harvest of your field and you leave some grain in the field, don't go back and get it. Let it go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows, so that the Lord your God blesses you in all that you do. Similarly, when you beat the olives of your olive trees, don't go back over them twice. Let the leftovers go to the... Again, when you pick the grapes of your vineyard, don't pick them over twice. Let the leftovers go to the immigrants, the orphans, and the widows. It's an ideal time for two widows to return to Bethlehem. This is from the Common English Bible, and I love that they use the word immigrants and not the word strangers, because stranger has a whole different meaning for us. But here we see this is part of the people on the margins that God's law provides for. And you know what's beautiful about the book of Ruth? There's so many places in the Bible where you see God's people, God gives them commands and they disobey. And then they receive judgment and terrible consequences. That does not happen in the book of Ruth. What you see instead is these two poor widows come into Bethlehem, and they receive exactly what this verse says. The people of Bethlehem obey their God, and Ruth is welcomed unto the field of Boaz. And there she's able to glean what the harvesters have left behind. And she brings all that back to her mother-in-law to provide for her. But not only does Boaz follow the letter of the law, but Boaz also follows the spirit of the law. He tells his workers, this woman is not to be harassed. She's not to be insulted. This woman is welcome at our table, and he invites her to eat with them, even though Moabites were considered contaminated, unclean people. She dips her bread into the same cups as all the other workers. She's entitled also to respect and to kindness. And she's also entitled to Sabbath, because in God's law, the Sabbath is for everyone. It is for the stranger that's in the community, the foreigner, as well as everyone else who's a native citizen. And so what you see in the book of Ruth is this beautiful picture. You have a story of flourishing. You have a story of two women who might have been vulnerable, but instead they're brought into this community. They are cared for like family. They are treated with the God-endowed dignity that they deserve, and everybody in the community flourishes. Now, I've often wondered, what would happen if Ruth were arriving today with her mother-in-law at the southern U.S. border? What would happen? Would Ruth be allowed to enter, to come in and accompany Naomi? And what would happen to Naomi without Ruth? An older woman without protection, who's not able to work and provide for herself. What would happen to Naomi? What would happen in the community without the blessing that these two women bring? I think that's a question that's important for us to sit with. There's a lot of my... I want us to remember this story and come back to it at the end. Now, when I talk about Naomi and Ruth and leaving, I think it's important to talk about the reasons people are on the move. So there's this series of sculptures. They were on in Marseille, in France. It's since been moved, but it's people like this, people with luggage, people carrying different things, but then there's pieces of them that are missing. And they're really powerful things to encounter. And the Somali poet Morrison Shire says, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark." I think that's really powerful. I was in Ireland before the pandemic, and they have all these, and it's the people who suffered the terrible potato famine and walked from their village coast so they could take a boat and migrate to North America. Just like most immigrants haven't been sitting in their home countries dreaming of migration. In fact, when they leave pieces of themselves behind. You leave family, comfort, culture, language, and you have to start all over again, like a child in a new country. It's a deeply painful and traumatic experience, but immigrants take on this journey either for economic reasons, like Ruth and Naomi, or out of a need to protect their lives or the lives of their families. But the immigrant life is not easy, and neither is the journey to a new country. And we're seeing that in the news right now. Right? We're seeing the crisis, the refugee crisis in Ukraine. We saw it a few months back. And we saw the crisis in Afghanistan, and those refugees fleeing and arriving in different countries. So it's worth discussing. Why is it that immigrants leave home? So there's 3 reasons that are documented for why people migrate to the U.S. The number one reason is to work, to improve their economic situation. Number 2 is to reunite their families. So maybe dad left, came to the U.S. to work a long time ago, and mom and the kids stayed behind, and now they want to bring the entire family back together. And the third is to flee persecution and violence. Now, there are people who sometimes leave their country seeking adventure and opportunity, but those are a smaller minority of people. So I think it's important, before we move on, to really define the terms. We use a lot of terms in the U.S. to talk about migration. I was telling Peter before you all came in that I was in Canada a couple of years ago, and they were talking about how in their country there's only 2 categories for immigrants in need: a refugee or a refugee claimant. That's it. We have like 10 to 12 terms. We have a lot of ways that we sort of divide and nuance. And so what I wanted you to know is that an asylee or asylum seeker is no different than a refugee. definition is exactly the same. The only difference is where they apply for the status. Refugees apply in a second country they fled to from their first country. So for example, Ukrainians who flee to Hungary can apply in Hungary through the United Nations Refugee Organization to then be given refuge in another country, Europe, Australia, US, Canada. And asylum seekers have to present themselves at a port of entry. So you might remember last year, Kamala Harris was in Guatemala, and she was telling people, do not come. And a lot of people were really upset about this, a lot of people who work in immigration. And it's because you can't apply for asylum anywhere but at the border of the country that you want to enter, or once you're already in. So when you tell people, don't come, you're telling them you have no solution, you have no hope. And this is what made a lot of people really upset. Because this is our law. This is what our law says. You have to present yourself there. So let's look at some other terms. So we have an immigrant. This is just any person who leaves their home country and moves permanently to another country. I want to tell you that only 4% of refugees are ever resettled. So that means 96% of the people who flee due to conflict and war don't ever get resettled in a Western country or anywhere else. They end up staying in sort of underground kind of economies to try to survive. So immigrants can also apply for asylum within 1 year of being admitted to the US. So I've seen this happen. There was, for example, a man who was in the US on a student visa, and while he was in the US, conflict broke out in his country, making it really dangerous for him to return, and so he then applied for asylum. But I want you to know that less than 10% of asylum applications are successful. The people who are coming to the US border, they're only applying for asylum. They're not being paroled in. They're staying on the other side in Mexico, and they're applying through our legal processes. But only 10% of those applications are successful. And it's legal under US law to apply for asylum. So they're not doing anything wrong by arriving and asking to apply for this and asking for a credible fear interview. All right. So I want us to discuss some of the facts, because there's a lot of misinformation about immigrants, and a lot of it is stoked by our political leaders who know better, but yet they continue to perpetuate false narratives. So there's a lot, since about the early 1900s, there have been studies done over and over again, to find a link between criminality and immigration. Now, they started doing those studies because they thought Italians were prone to criminality, and they were migrating at that time. They also thought Eastern European immigrants were unable to assimilate and lacked intellectual capacity. So they started doing these studies that, no, immigration is bad and those people become criminals, and there is no link between immigration and criminality. In fact, immigrants are less likely to be in prison, less likely to commit crimes, and we'll talk about why that is. We're just normal people. It's not because we're better people. We'll talk about the reasons for that. What was also found is that immigrants are more likely to be victims of crime. So, immigrants are more likely to be victims of unreported crimes. The number one is wage theft, then assault, muggings, domestic violence, and sexual assault, human trafficking. Immigrants are more likely to experience workforce inequities, to work underpaid, or to have no paid time off, and to experience exploitation at work and a breakdown in family structures. So not only is that, but you also have the reality that according to, the name just escaped me. But anyway, according to this agency, Amnesty International, that's it, 70 to 80% immigrant women who cross the border between the U.S. and Mexico are sexually assaulted. In fact, when I was on a trip a few years ago, there are actually Catholic groups, so Catholic groups, I want you to remember that, who are distributing birth control to women, so at least there wouldn't be pregnancies from the rapes that they experience. So when I worked in the legal clinic, I never thought working in immigration law would mean that every day I would meet a victim of sexual violence. But every day there was at least one woman who would come in and tell a story like this. Sometimes it's other migrants on the journey, sometimes it's officials on either side, and often it is human smugglers who are helping people make the journey. This is the real crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border. It's the vulnerability of women and girls. So undocumented immigrant women experience danger entering the U.S., and then once they're here, they also experience poor conditions. So I think it's important to talk about how it is that we got here. Because we have this sort of mythical narrative, right, about the United States being a country of immigrants, right, the Statue of Liberty, and give me your tired and your poor. So how did we get to a place where immigrants experience this kind of vulnerability? And it's been going on for a long, long time. Let's look at some notable dates in immigration history. So I thought it was interesting. I was watching TV once, and I saw this well-known broadcaster talking about, it was a picture of him and his, in Ireland, and he was saying something like, oh, my family comes from this part of Ireland, and they all migrated legally, and there was a date of their migration that he was announcing. And I thought it was really interesting that he said they migrated legally because there were no immigration laws at the time that they migrated. And so they didn't migrate legally or illegally. There was those terms, that kind of understanding of immigration didn't even exist for a long, long time until the 20th century. The first immigration law is the Chinese Exclusion Act. 1882, and it did exactly what it sounds like. Chinese immigrants were brought here to build the railroad, and when it was built, they were asked to leave. And so I found out, I was in northern Mexico, and found out there's a community of Mexicans of Chinese descent in northern Mexico, because when this law was enacted, and some Chinese immigrants were afraid of being expelled, they just fled south. And they settled in northern Mexico. And so there's a community there still. And you have in 1924, and I want you to know that the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't repealed until the 1940s. So it was on the books for a really long time. In 1924, we have this Immigration Act, and this is the first federal policy that's supposed to be for everyone. And so this is very strict quotas based on national origin. There was something called the Immigration Restriction League, and this group was created because of something called eugenics, which you might be familiar with. This idea, this is a junk science, it's not real, but it was basically the idea that some people are inherently superior to other people, and of course it's always white people who were superior. And so you had Slavic people, even Southern Europeans really weren't considered white. Neither were Slavic people, neither were Jewish people from Eastern Europe and Russia. And so there were these restrictions and very strict quotas of how many of those people could enter the country. So if you were Northern European, Scandinavian, British, any of those countries in the north, German, you could come in. But if you were from these other quote-unquote undesirable groups, then there were very strict quotas about who could come in and who could not. Then in 1965, we had the Immigration and Nationality Act, and this is the first federal law that's based on family connections and employability skills. So this is the first law that is not racist, believe it or not. It's not based on race. It's not based on we want to keep these people out and we want these people in. It's the first time that it says no, immigration will be based on family connections, so sponsorship has to be close family members, and employability. Can we bring in people for jobs that we need here? So we give a lot of visas to software engineers and doctors from other countries, right? Employability skills. So this was in 1965, and I want you to think about that date and what else was going on in this country in 1965. And it's the civil rights movement. And they have everything to do with each other. The fact that we have the first non-racist law has everything to do with the fact that the civil rights movement was happening, and the mistreatment and the laws that were unjust, that were harming Black Americans, highlighted other laws that harmed other people of color as well. And so that is when this law came into being. It's a reason for people to really unite in solidarity at injustice, because it has this positive ripple effect in society. But things didn't go great from there in 1986. And I want you to know that in 1996, Bill Clinton was president. There's a misconception that Democrats are really pro-immigration and really good for immigrants, and Republicans are not. And that's just simply not true. The history does not hold up in terms of that. In fact, Republicans have done slightly more. Ronald Reagan had an amnesty for undocumented immigrants in 1986. I mean, can you imagine that happening today? But there is no party of immigration. There is none. Even Joe Biden has broken all the promises that he made about what he was going to do about immigration. And maybe there's good reasons for that, but the fact is it's still not happening. So the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, what it did is there are so many people suffering because of this law. What it did is it basically said that if you came into the U.S. and you were not admitted legally, so you crossed the border, and you acquired 6 months or more of unlawful presence, that in order for you to adjust your status, so let's say you came in illegally, but now you're married to a U.S. citizen, you have U.S. citizen children, you're working, everything's good, you can adjust your status, right? You're married to a U.S. citizen, that's a close relationship. Well, first, you have to be deported to your country for 10 years, because that's the penalty. And after that time, you can come back and be reunited with your family. That's what this law says. It's called the 3 and 10-year bar. So less than a year, less than 6 months, you can be barred for 3 years. But anything more than that, it's 10 years. So there's a lot of people suffering under this law who are not able to adjust their status and who are separated from their families because of this. In fact, I was at a conference in Michigan, and my Uber driver ended up being a man from Mexico. He married a U.S. citizen, but they were stuck. He couldn't adjust his status. He was going to be barred for 10 years. His wife, his American wife, moved the whole family. So him and her and the kids, they moved to Juarez in Mexico, and she would cross the border every day and go to work in El Paso. And that was the only way they could keep the family together. And for 10 years they did this so that they could keep their family together and fulfill the requirements of the penalty. So this is some of the laws, and you know, I think there's a lot that people believe about immigration, that people want to violate laws, that people want to come in and sort of disregard laws that exist. But actually, the laws that have existed and are currently on the books are not just and are not good, and they're harming a lot of people. So immigration is an economic issue, a social issue, a political issue, and it's also a Christian and a biblical issue. And I want to talk about some of these things, because immigration is an issue that's fundamentally about people who are made in the image of God. So we don't say illegals, we say undocumented or unauthorized immigrants, because illegal is really, first of all, it's an adjective, right, not a noun. And it's really dehumanizing to call someone an illegal, an alien. So you're going to hear me use undocumented or unauthorized immigrants. So God has a special concern for the immigrant. So this word ger is the Hebrew word closest to immigrant, stranger. It appears 92 times in the Hebrew Bible. And usually it's like this. The same law applies to the native born and to the immigrant living among you. So I love this quote. It says, the scriptural witness is that we are to care for the immigrant stranger living among us, without any caveat that exempts us from this responsibility if it's not in our economic interest. And I want to unpack that a little bit, because I want you to know that immigration is actually good for our economy. So people often bring up to me Romans 13, which is this verse right here. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So this is the most common question that's asked of me. What about the law? People are breaking the law. And I want to highlight that U.S. laws are not immutable. We've had a lot of laws that have changed over time. It used to be legal to own people and enslave them. It used to be legal that you could beat your spouse and your children, and it was a private matter. That was no one's business. It used to be legal that women couldn't vote or own property. But we recognized over time that these laws were harmful and that they were hurting people. They weren't helping them. Laws aren't more important than the people that they're designed to guide and to protect. And that's why we have a legislative branch, right, to review these things and to change laws. And that's what immigration advocates want, is for us to look at these laws that we have that are harming people and change them. So I want to talk about a few of the facts around immigration. So immigrants today aren't any different than the Irish, or the Germans, or the Italians. We have the same need and the same humanity. So what has changed then? If the immigrants themselves haven't changed, what has changed? And so what's happened is the laws have changed. I told you that back when this broadcaster, his family migrated to the US, there were no laws, but now there's a lot of laws, and they're quite long and complicated. But for a lot of people, there's no lines to get into to migrate lawfully, and that's a misconception that a lot of people have. They think people just need to get in line. There are no lines for many people. So this leads to unlawful migration, and unlawful migration is bad, not because it's breaking the law, but because it harms people. Those immigrants become vulnerable and invisible. So, how can people migrate legally to the U.S.? And I want you to, the best way for you to remember this is blood, sweat, tears, and luck. These are the only 4 ways to come into the U.S. So blood, you have to be a close relative. Has to be close. Parent, child, spouse, sibling. Now, shortest lines are for spouse and children under 21. If I were to sponsor, let's say I had a brother in Guatemala that I was going to sponsor to come to the U.S. The wait is 13 years for my brother to get an immigrant visa. If I were Mexican or Indian or Filipino, the wait is 23 years for my brother to get his visa. So the priorities are only for spouse and parent of a child under 21. Sweat, limited numbers of visas for highly educated people. So, and I mean limited. It used to be that 5,000 people a day came through Ellis Island. We have 5,000 visas a year for employers. So that's a huge difference from 1 day to 1 year. SEERS, this is a fraction of 1% of the world's refugees. That's what we take in, a fraction of 1%. And it has to be fleeing persecution. So when I say Ruth is an economic immigrant, I mean she's an economic immigrant. She doesn't qualify to be a refugee. You have to be persecuted to be a refugee. And she's not persecuted. She's in need. She's poor. and she's experiencing a famine, but she's not considered a refugee by the definition. And look, there is a diversity visa lottery, and it's only for certain countries, and there's a 1 in 300 chance. You have to be educated to be able to qualify for it. So that's it. These are the only 4 ways. If you don't have the right relationships, the right skill set, if you're not being persecuted, and if you're not lucky enough to get one of those visas, which you can only do if you're from a country that doesn't have a lot of representation in the U.S. So I know somebody from Burundi who got one, but somebody from Mexico can't apply for one. Nobody from Central America can apply for one. Nobody from China, India, Philippines can apply for one. So you have to be in countries that are underrepresented. So 55% of refugees to the U.S. are Christians. So under President Trump, there was a lot of fear stoked around refugees. But this is a fact. We take in actually a lot of persecuted Christians that are minorities. So the church in Iraq, the church in Palestine, the church in Egypt. So we take in 55% of these people are Christian. Now I want to be clear that I don't think we should only let people in if they're Christians. We should let in people. But there's a misunderstanding around who refugees are and what they're bringing and who they are. Most of the people that we let in, the majority, over 50%, are Christians. So undocumented immigrants pay taxes. And this is shocking to a lot of people. They think that undocumented immigrants are not paying taxes. But in fact, the IRS provides them something called an individual tax identification number. Or they often work with a fake Social Security card. And so what happens is that you pay into the system because you have a job and you have this number or you have this Social Security card, but you can't ever file taxes to get a return. So on average, immigrants pay $80,000 more than they'll ever get back from the system. Because remember, people primarily come here to work. And they come in their prime working ages. So as much as $12 billion in taxes every single year. And that doesn't include things like, this is federal, doesn't include things like sales tax, property taxes paid through rental of different properties. So it's actually a lot higher than this. So I want you to think about something. How come our government has such a conflicting response to immigration? You have one part, you have the IRS and the Social Security Administration. They accommodate payments from undocumented immigrants. But you have another part of the government, DHS, who says they shouldn't be present and is actively seeking to deport them. So it's almost like having 2 signs at the borderlands. And one of them says, help wanted. But the other one says, keep out. The fact is, immigrants are able to come in and they're able to get jobs. And people who hire them, they're not really penalized. In fact, they can opt out of doing any kind of electronic verification to make sure that someone has the legal right to work in the U.S. Unless they have a federal contract, then they're required. So it's really interesting that even at the national level, we don't have a unified response to the way that we want work. And immigrants create jobs. They don't take jobs. They also fill in the holes in the labor market at the high and low end of the job scale. Nearly all economists, even libertarian ones, agree that immigration, particularly immigration of undocumented people, is good for the United States and its economy. And immigrants bring strong family values, learn English, and integrate into our communities. So this is something that a lot of people say, well, people aren't learning English. So you may be right about that, because in fact, only 23% of first-generation immigrants speak English well. They're adults, and moving to another country as an adult, when you have to work, you have responsibilities, maybe you have children, it's really difficult to devote all of your free time to learning English. So usually those people learn survival English, and that's it. But their kids, 88% of second-generation immigrants speak English well. By the third generation, we've lost the first language. It's gone. So this idea that people don't integrate, it just simply isn't true. Now, in the city where I live, in Baltimore, there's a Little Italy. There's a little German neighborhood. They're historic now, right? Historic neighborhoods. There's a little Irish neighborhood, historically, right? Because when people came, what did they do? They settled with people like them. People who spoke their language, people who knew their food and their family and their traditions. That's just a very natural thing. In fact, when I lived overseas and I was on a train in Kazakhstan, I ended up being on a train with another American. It was such a huge relief to find another American that's who I sat with and talked to in English the entire time. Because that's natural. You want to be comfortable, and what's more comfortable than your heart language, your heart culture? And immigrants have an excellent work ethic. And through their work, they support our social systems. Most immigrants to the U.S. are in their prime working ages. So immigrants are 13% of the U.S. population, but they're 16% of the workforce. So we make up a higher percentage of the workforce than the actual population. And this is particularly important in the medical field, where we see a lot of immigrants in these different fields. So this number that you see right there, 22% of nursing, psychiatric, and home health aides, that's really important as baby boomers are retiring. And as some are in assisted living facilities, nursing facilities, as you know, it was quite a large generation like the millennials. And so there's a really high need for home health care workers, nursing assistants to take care of our aging population. And much of our food comes from California and Central Valley. 70 to 75% of farm workers are undocumented. And immigrants are good neighbors. Historically, as immigration rates increase, crime decreases. And I told you that I would tell you why this was. And it's because of really three things. One is the threat of deportation. So we will suffer more for criminal behavior. So because of that, we're less likely to break the law. Also, there's the healthy immigrant thesis. So contrary to what you may think, in other countries, people know it's going to be hard to migrate. It's going to be a hard life, and it's going to be a lot of work. So they self-select, where the people who come here are the ones who are willing to work. And the third is there's greater enforcement. So there's a lot more deportation of unlawful immigrants. So in short, I can tell you that immigration is good for countries, and it's good for their economies. But even if it weren't, it doesn't matter. God tells us to welcome immigrants, to do justice for immigrants, and to love immigrants as we do ourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and I want to give us a chance to have some discussion and questions. So if you have questions or comments, snide remarks, you can feel free to speak up. I'd be happy to talk with you.
As an immigrant who, at least in my eyes, would consider you one of the lucky ones, how do you handle working and doing this work on a day-to-day basis, knowing that not everybody is you and is the lucky one?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. You know, I didn't even know that our family was that lucky. It wasn't until I was an adult. When my family migrated, the line was really short, compared to today. It was only 3 years. So we were undocumented for 3 years, but then our immigrant visa was available. But I think about what it'd be like if we had migrated today, and that same wait would be 13 years. I migrated when I was 10. That means I wouldn't have been able to go to college. I wouldn't have been able to get a job until I was 23. I mean, that's a long time to wait. It is really hard, and I encourage people to think about that. It's just a jackpot, a genetic jackpot that we hit when we're born in certain places that are stable, that are okay. And sometimes we have to acknowledge that these very stable places are often imperialist and create instability in other places. And that was the case with my family. You know, my parents were not people who wanted to migrate. My dad has a college education in Guatemala. It was not their dream at all. The United States funded a civil war in Guatemala. And it drove so many people out of our country. So it's ironic, right? The United States funded this war, and now they received a lot of Guatemalan immigrants. Like the second largest city of Guatemalans outside of Guatemala is Los Angeles because of this war. So yeah, to me, it's one of those mysteries, to be honest with you, one of those sort of laments and things that I don't understand about the world and about God's work in the world on behalf of immigrants who are vulnerable and who are suffering. And I encounter a lot of immigrants where we have to say, there's no solution for you. But you're educated, try Canada. Or let's try this kind of visa and see if we can work this way. Or some people just decide, I'm going to stay and try to, you know, stay under the radar and hope I'm not found and deported. But yeah, it's really disheartening, and to be honest, I don't really have a lot of hope for like people like Joe Biden or, you know, Mitch McConnell to make a difference. I think it's clear that hoping for them to make a change is gonna be an upend. And there's a theologian and Christian ethicist that I really appreciate. His name is Miguel de la Torre, and one of the things that he says is that there's a kind of, he calls it a theology or an ethics of, screw it, is actually what he says, of there are people now who recognize this too, and they just try to work against the system whatever way they can. So I heard about this in the UK. People get on planes, British people who are citizens, get on deportation flights, and they stand up, refusing to let the flight take off. And this is their way of messing with the system, of screwing with the system, because the system is unjust. They've tried the advocacy role. They've tried to get governments to change laws and to make them more just, and it's just not happening. So now they're just subverting them any way they can. I saw this in North Carolina, in a community where the community came out and just surrounded an ICE truck and refused to let them take away their neighbors. The sanctuary movement is born out of this ethic of messing with the system as well. Like, nope, you can't come into this church, right, and take out this immigrant person. So I think this is where the Holy Spirit can help us to be creative, because I think it's ethical and right for Christians to disobey laws that are harmful, that harm God's children.
So what pushed you to figure out this information regarding immigration in the Bible? Like, what was it, a part of your story, or just one day you just decided to look in the Bible and you found nothing related to it?
So, yeah, what happened for me, honestly, is I read a lot of different books as I was working in church engagement in the Baltimore, D.C., Northern Virginia area. And it was my job to go to churches and talk to church leaders about God's heart for immigrants. But what I saw is that there wasn't a lot of accessible theology for pastors and for congregations. And there were a lot of great books, and I have a lot of great books that I can recommend to you. And so I read this essay by a rabbi who's not a Christian, and it's called Holy Economics. And he actually went through the story of Ruth in a way I'd never seen before. And then he talked about the story of Abraham and Sarah. And that's really what inspired me, to be honest with you, is reading these different rabbis and the things that they were writing about immigration from their understanding of the Hebrew Bible. So that's where it was born for me. And then I thought, Christians need to be engaged in this. These are our scriptures too, right? The Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So that's why I was really moved to write about this. And honestly, also because not a lot of immigrants write these books. There's a lot of people adjacent to our community, and I think that's great. There's lots of audiences, and I'm happy that people care and are writing books about this. But I think there's a space for people with a lived experience of migration to also speak about it and write about it. And that's what I wanted to do as well, because I wanted people to have that perspective. This is what it's like to be displaced.
What do you see as some of the main obstacles that stand in the way of laws changing to become more just?
Yeah, I think the main obstacle is I don't think our leaders have the will to make the change. Because I don't know if you follow like Pew Research studies, but it shows that most Americans are in favor of, for example, providing a pathway to citizenship for recipients of DACA. These are immigrants who were brought here as children by their parents, and now they have this temporary status called deferred action for childhood arrivals. There's like an 80% of Americans want this, and our legislators still won't do it. And I think a lot of it is sort of political football. Our government isn't working like it should, for the people. And so they don't have the will to do it, and so they're not. And it doesn't matter who's in the White House. In fact, believe it or not, one of the better presidents for immigration was George W. Bush. And I think it's because he's from a border state, and he grew up on a ranch with immigrant people, who worked there, sort of had a more personal connection than a lot of people. His brother married a Mexican immigrant. So, yeah, I don't think our leaders really intend to make any changes, because even the lowest hanging fruit that would not harm them in any way, they refuse to take action on. So about the best thing that we've seen is all presidents, prior to President Trump, but all presidents had set a very high refugee ceiling, making the U.S. the country that received the most. Now, we still only receive a quarter of a percent of the world's refugees, but still we let in more than other countries. And that was always done by every president until Donald Trump, and then Joe Biden has instituted that again. Unfortunately, the infrastructure was destroyed under Donald Trump, and it's going to take decades to build it back. So one person can do a lot of harm.
How was it decided which countries maybe have a favorable, a better chance of becoming citizens in the United States? I asked the question because a friend of mine met a woman online from Sweden. She came over on a passport tourist, and they got married while she was here. It seems that her path to citizenship was fairly easy. A few hoops to jump through, within maybe 3 or 4 years she was a U.S. citizen. Is the fact that she's from Sweden help her?
Yes.
Okay, so who decides which countries are the good countries or the right countries?
Yeah.
And the wrong ones?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. So the State Department. So my brother and sister-in-law work for the State Department. They're actually based at the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua. And yes, there are countries that are deemed, safer. So countries like Sweden, like the UK, people don't have to have visas to come here. They can be in the U.S. up to 6 months. And so people can come here, and let's say she came here, she was admitted legally, and let's say met a U.S. citizen, got married. When you marry a U.S. citizen and you were admitted legally into the U.S., your pathway to citizenship is really, really short. It's only a few years. Now, the waits right now are really long because, again, President Trump kind of dismantled a lot of things. but they're still shorter than for other people. Other people have to be residents for 5 years, but if you marry someone, the path is a lot shorter. And yes, it's true, if you're a Northern European, Australian, Canadian, it's a much, much easier path. And you know, I've seen a lot of things on social media where people are saying, oh, we need to bring in Ukrainian refugees to the US, and we do. But I want you to know that we already do, and we have for a long time. In fact, these were the only immigrants, really, the only refugees that President Trump let in. Because we have this thing called the Lautenberg Amendment. You can look it up. It was originally designed to help Jewish people after World War II find safety, refuge in other countries. But now it's been extended not just to Jewish people, but to other faiths, people who are persecuted for their faith in other countries. So Ukrainian and former Soviet peoples are able to come in under that. And so in the organization that I work for, we have offices in Seattle and in Northern California, and there's a lot of resettlement of former Soviet people, and most of them from Ukraine that are resettled. So we already take in a lot of refugees. And you know, one of the most helpful indicators so that you can know how successful a resettled person is going to be in the U.S. is actually their race. So former Soviet people, because they're white, they have a much, much easier time than other people. The hardest is for immigrants who are black. In the Caribbean, Africa, and from Latin America, either Afro-Cubans, Afro-Guatemalans, Afro-Mexicans, they have the hardest time.
In your book, you talk about a lot of different stories. Are any of them, like now, that still stick out to you, that you still like reference a lot in like your own work, that you have in your book? And later even, do you have any other ones that you would add into what you've written?
Yeah, so you mean stories of other immigrants?
Mm-hmm.
So the stories of the immigrants that I tell, other than my family and me, the stories that I tell are composites. And mostly because I worked in a legal setting, and so those are legal cases, stories have to be protected. But also because I feel like people have a right to their own story, and I don't want to take their story and tell it in my words. It may not be their own understanding of, or the way that they would tell their own story. So what I do is I take really common situations and create composites in order to sort of honor people. And yes, and I have other stories that I've added into, so I just finished another book that comes out in October. It's sort of part 2 of the first book, and that book also has a lot of composite stories. But again, it's the things that come up most frequently. So there's a story that I tell in the book about a woman who experienced sexual violence and who fled to the U.S. for that reason. And that's because I encountered that so much, and that's why I created a composite story of that woman. And sadly, I've encountered women like her and women who had pregnancies from results of sexual violence and are now raising children of the person who violated them and harmed them. Any other questions? Well, I know we're at time, and I want to thank you for giving up your Sunday evening to come out and have this conversation. People always ask me what gives me hope. I don't have any hope in Mitch McConnell or Joe Biden, but I have a lot of hope in gatherings like this when people come together and give up time to have a conversation because they care about their immigrant neighbors and they want to know how they can serve them, how they can change their thinking, how they can inform others about the plight and the need and the humanity of their immigrant neighbors. So thank you.
Well, thanks again very much to you, Karen, for being with us this evening. There will be another lecture tomorrow morning during our convocation, and this will be over at Memorial Hall. everyone's welcome to join that as well. And for community members anywhere, there will be live stream for that as well. So we hope if you're able that you can come and join us again tomorrow. Let's give Karen Gonzalez one more round of applause yet for and go in peace.